Zimbabwe cash crisis worse. About Venezuela once again. Systemic important banks. They removed the 1,000 thing right there called monetary awareness. Hey there, hope all is well. Back here today with some more RT News updates. And as you can tell from today's title, Jack Lew says the U.S. is bankrupt or going broke, as if it's something new. And so I have a couple articles I want to share with you, all dealing with a recent article that came out today from former Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew and his thoughts on how this upcoming tax bill or this pending tax bill will leave the U.S. broke, as he's quoted as saying, but yet is as if he already wasn't aware of the fact that the United States have been running a deficit for many, many years. And during his little commentary on a Bloomberg show, he mentioned about how during his era as budget secretary as well as manager and whatnot, he actually helped things out somewhat, but yet ultimately, as it always ends up, you know, the nation is broke, and it's been that way for a while. It's not a Republican or a Democrat thing. It's just the fact that our government has overextended itself to the point where it's grown so massive that it can no longer fund itself. And so before I dive into those articles, as always, I want to encourage you to click the subscribe button for more RT News updates, live talks, as well as interviews. And if you're new to RTD, I want to encourage you to visit the RTD University website, where I put together all my prior interviews dealing with the dollar, our debt, the importance of precious metals, as well as other things. So let's dive into today's news. So the first article here is from Bloomberg, and it says, former Treasury Secretary Lew says tax cut will leave the U.S. broke. And then I want to actually go back in the history a little bit and show you from another article where it talks about the U.S. deficit by year compared to GDP and how it's been increasing over the last several presidents. So it's not a a Republican or Democratic thing. It's just the fact that our government has grown too big to sustain itself. The next one here is actually a breakdown by president to show that it's not, once again, a Republican or Democratic thing, or it's not a party thing. It's just the idea that government has overextended itself. And then more importantly, how, 5 things that will happen to you when America goes bankrupt. And then also I want to point out an interview I had with Jerry Robinson, who's the author of a book called Bankruptcy of Our Nation. And during our conversation from a while back, he gave a lot of great informative details on how this whole bankruptcy came about. And in his book, he lists various ways on how you can avoid some of the consequences that our government has put our nation into on a personal level. So before I dive into that, let's go back to the very first one. As always, I'll leave the link to all those below for you to dive into further for yourself. But just to give you an idea what's on the surface, it says former U.S. Treasury Secretary Jacob J. Lew said that Trump administration's decision to add significant amount of debt through the last year's tax legislation is leaving the country broke. He's quoted as saying, "It's a ticking time bomb in terms of debt," said Lew on a Bloomberg radio. He says, "You cannot run a fiscal policy by spending trillions of dollars you don't have at a time that the economy is doing well," supposedly. It says the next shoe to drop is going to be an attack on the most vulnerable in our society. It says, Lew said, "How are you going to pay for the deficit caused by a tax cut? We are going to see proposals to cut health insurance for the poor people, to take basic food support away from poor people, to attack Medicare and Social Security. One could not have made up a more cynical strategy." He's also quoted saying, "What we've seen is a tax cut that spends money we don't have to have very concentrated benefits for global corporations and the top 1%, and is leaving us broke." So just the mere fact that he lists out a few things that will be impacted in this whole deficit spending as we move forward. And during that that little short clip of video wise, he hinted at how these tax cuts ultimately lead towards some type of spending cuts, which will impact those that are in most need of it. And then he lists, as he said there, the Medicaid, Medicare, all the government entitlement spendings that are in and of themselves have become a massive problem that has handicapped our nation in general. And so I want to actually go to that and give you an idea what that looks like. And so here we have the U.S. debt clock, and it gives an idea of just the current standing of our nation. And so as of now, we're at $20.5 trillion. And so the federal spending, they're spending $4 trillion a year and taking in $3.3 trillion in revenue from taxes. And so that leaves them with a $659 billion shortfall that they have to find somewhere. And where do they find that from? They borrow it. So in and of itself, our nation is already broke because we're spending more than we're bringing in, and there is no savings plan. The United States government has no form of true savings. And so what used to be considered savings was back when our money was backed by precious metals in the form of gold, which kept this type of spending from getting out of hand because you couldn't spend more than you had in your vaults in terms of physical metal. So just give you an idea of some of the spending cuts that Jack Lew is hinting at will have to be taken away. And it's going to be Medicare, Medicaid, which is $1.1 trillion. Social Security, which is $951 billion. Our defensive spending has been increased as of the last couple of weeks, and so it's at $641 billion. Then we have income security, is $295 billion, and then you have the interest on our debt alone, which is $278 billion. And so that right there in of itself kind of hints at the fact that we are already broke or virtually bankrupt, just haven't officially defaulted yet. But yet, depending on how you measure default, some might say that because the Federal Reserve note is working on a minimum of 3% of its original purchasing power, that in and of itself could be considered a default to the public. So the next one here I want to get into is from thebalance.com, and it talks about the deficit by year. And so if you want to go through and find out more for yourself, but it just paints a nice picture as to our history of our debt and deficits by the year. And so it goes all the way back to 1929. Back when our debt was pretty minimum in comparison to what it is now. But as we get into the 90s, it talks about a little bit of surplus. And Jack Lew gave himself credit for being part of this during the Clinton era when they were actually in the positive. And then it goes on here to most recently since the whole banking crisis. And it kind of lists some of the main catalysts that led to the deficit spending. And here we had 9/11 attacks and all the things that came from that. We had the war on terror. We have Hurricane Katrina and the Bankruptcy Act in 2005. We had the Bernanke scandal. We had the Iraq War, the bank bailouts because of the whole Great Recession. And so here, because of the Great Recession, which kind of started, it's unfortunate that President Obama inherited it, but it went from 459 billion into the 1.4 trillion, 1.2 trillion, 1.3 trillion, and so forth. And then towards the last couple of years, they try to give you some numbers saying that Jack Lew, who was in charge during this time, said he brought it down a little bit to 666 billion. No, that's nothing. But yeah, that's just what we're being told. And so there's been a lot of reports saying that there's trillions of dollars that hasn't been reported that we know nothing about. So that's for you to find out for yourself. Then the next one here is U.S. deficit by president. And as I mentioned, it's not a Republican or a Democrat thing. It's just the government in and of itself is too big to sustain itself. So this type of thing will always happen. So it gives a breakdown of how under President Obama, it says by the end of the fiscal budget year, his deficit was 6.69 trillion, which is the largest deficit of any American president. Then it goes right to George Bush, who is no better. Then it goes to Reagan. Then it goes to George H.W. Bush, and so forth. So, and then the next one is something for you to really think about. This is an older article, but it says here 5 things that will happen to you when America goes bankrupt. So it was written in 2011, but yet the principles and ideas still remain true to this day. It says your life savings could be reduced to nothing almost overnight. And it says inflation is a fact of life. It says as of 1998, a $100 bill would not buy you as much as a $20 bill would in the 1960s. It says, however, the government have traditionally done with this, simply can't pay their debts, and they print money. The problem with this is further you expand the money supply, the less the money you already have on hand is worth. Then the next one, it says your taxes will skyrocket. It says we've been conned into thinking that we can fund a massive government on the banks of the rich. This is simply not so. So this plays into the idea that every type of tax reform always is pointing at we must tax the rich, we must tax the rich. And so this starts off with taxing the rich, but yet because the rich have so much money, there are so many loopholes for them to avoid actually losing the bulk of their wealth. It ultimately trickles down to those that are more dependent upon the businesses and the things that the wealthy provide for the commoner, which are the employees more so, which ultimately impacts them. And so it says this is simply not so. It's not working today and it's not going to happen in the future. It says we cannot tax the rich enough to pay off our debt or even attempt or even enough to keep the government going long term. The next one, your life could be in danger. It says if the government goes bankrupt, you'll have an extremely angry, confused, and frustrated populace that has little faith in its leaders, combined with a horrific economy and a reduced ability of the government to keep order. There's going to be a massive amounts of rioting and all types of things that will not be pretty. And then it says here, number 4, your payments from the government will dramatically decrease or stop altogether. It says, contrary to what some people believe, Medicare, Social Security are paid out of the same fund that pays for everything else. In other words, if the government goes bankrupt, there is no money set aside to pay for these programs. Then the very last one, which was something that most people really don't think about, says you will have a dramatically reduced standard of living. Here in the Western world, we've been privileged because of the Federal Reserve note being the reserve currency of the planet, and the fact that this deficit spending has allowed us to send out Federal Reserve notes to every other place. It sends up actual tangible goods from the hard sweat and labor of a lot of people making a minimum wage and a lot lower. So we've been living high on the hog for decades now. And what he's saying is that if this reduced standard of living comes into play, it says taxes and inflation will escalate dramatically, both of which are very likely if we go bankrupt. Economic activity will slow to a crawl and we'll go into a depression. And so here's that video. I'll put the link down below, but it's a great interview, and it's about 24 minutes of me and Jerry Robinson. He's the author of America's Completely Bankrupt, and so he goes into more detail. But that's kind of what's happening in regards to the statement made by Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew and how he said America will go broke. America's already broke. It just hasn't really become a primary subject in our everyday news because we've been able to cover things up with the continuing borrowing, which has led to a greater and greater deficit spending that is eventually going to come to an end. Because think about it, in any other realm of life, there's no way a person or family or a company or anything could operate by continuously borrowing with no real plan or no real way of being able to repay that debt back. And so ultimately it will come to an end, and when it does, as that article by the 5 things that will be the most detrimental to you and I, will be the complete wiping away of everything that we've saved that's denominated in the Federal Reserve note, as well as just a standard of living going to levels where we've never or really ever could imagine. And so that's more, in my opinion, I think is more second or third world status, where, you know, you'll have just the basics, you know, if that, to survive, and along with that, everything that's uncomfortable that we've never really known here in the developed world. So just want to put together this article dealing with the statements from Jack Lew. I think it's quite telling of what's really happening when a former Secretary Treasurer who was in charge of our books says that the United States is broke. Lets me know that it's probably a lot worse than what he's stating. So once again, like I said before, it's not a Republican Democrat thing. Just the fact that our government is growing too large and it's going to impact us in ways that we've never known before. So just something to consider and something to think about. So other than that, I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know your thoughts below. And as always, if you find this informative, please share this with your family and friends so they can find out the true state of our economy and see that Uncle Sam really is tapped out, and that there's no real way of recovering from this because we borrowed beyond our means to repay. So there must be a day of reckoning one day, and it will not be pretty. So other than that, hope all is well. See you later.